You know, when you buy like a highly demanding, cutting-edge software program, you expect it to do some pretty amazing things.
Right, of course.
But if you try to take that shiny new software and run it on a computer built, say, 20 years ago, the screen freezes, the system lags, the fans start sounding like a jet engine trying to take off from your desk.
Yeah, and the funny thing is the hardware itself isn't actually broken in that scenario. I
Yeah.
mean, it is perfectly fine, functioning exactly as it was originally designed to do.
Right, it's just doing its job.
Exactly. The problem is the operating environment. You're asking the hardware to process an environment it was, well, never built to understand.
Now take that image, swap the old computer for the human brain, and swap the demanding software for the modern public school system.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are exploring a question that affects almost every single one of us. Why does the modern educational system feel so incredibly stressful, exhausting, and frankly unnatural for so many students?
It's a huge question.
It really is. And to figure this out, we're looking at a truly eye-opening piece of research from Psychology Today by Dr. Geher. It's titled Four Mismatches Between Evolution and Education.
And the core mission of our analysis today is to kind of strip away the familiarity of the school system and look at it through the lens of human evolutionary history.
Right.
We're going to uncover the biological mechanisms that make traditional schooling so difficult for developing brains and explore why the daily struggles students face are actually deeply rooted in our ancestral biology.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we even look at the physical structure of a classroom, the desks, the bells, the standardized tests, we have to look at the actual people inside that room.
Yeah, the social environment.
Exactly. Dr. Geher frames this entire discussion with a really powerful anecdote. He was talking with a friend whose 14-year-old daughter was just completely miserable. She was a somewhat introverted kid, and she was absolutely dreading going to high school every single day.
And the reason for her dread had nothing to do with, like, the academic workload or a sudden drop in her abilities.
Right. It wasn't the homework.
No, not at all. Despite the school district being relatively small, this girl had been separated from her familiar middle school peer group. The administration had simply reshuffled the student body, throwing her into daily classes where she literally didn't know anyone.
Wow.
She was spending 7 hours a day in rooms full of strangers.
As a parent, or really just as a human being listening to this, your first instinct is to feel terrible for her and try to give her coping mechanisms. You want to help her adapt so she can focus on her history test.
Sure, that's the natural reaction.
But Dr. Geisher's reaction completely flips the script. He didn't focus on the daughter's inability to adapt. He explicitly blamed the environment.
Yeah, he pointed out that throwing a developing human being into a massive group of new strangers every single year is, well, it's a fundamental violation of how our brains evolved to function.
Right, and this introduces the foundational concept of our entire discussion today, which is evolutionary mismatch.
Yes, evolutionary mismatch. To grasp the physical toll this takes on a student, imagine standing around an ancestral campfire under the stars.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. For nearly all of human evolutionary history, we were nomads. That quiet, hyper-familiar environment is where the human brain spent 99% of its existence.
Wow, 99%.
Yeah, we lived in small, tight-knit clans of maybe 50 to 100 people. The faces sitting across the fire from you were the same faces you saw yesterday, and they were the faces you would see for the rest of your life.
So you knew everyone's history, their moods, where you stood in the social hierarchy.
Totally. Your brain didn't have to spend any energy figuring out who was a threat or who was an ally. You were entirely surrounded by the known.
Which sounds pretty relaxing, honestly.
It is. Because encountering a stranger in that nomadic setting was an incredibly rare and potentially dangerous anomaly. Because of that reality, humans evolved an entirely different neurological mechanism for processing strangers compared to familiar kin.
Like an alarm bell.
Exactly. When an ancestral human met someone unknown, the brain's amygdala would immediately signal for a spike in vigilance. Biology dictated a heavy dose of hesitation, skepticism, and a release of stress hormones like cortisol.
Because an unknown person outside the clan could literally represent a life or death threat.
Precisely.
Now, I have to push back a little bit here because I think you listening might be thinking the exact same thing. We don't live in nomadic clans anymore.
True.
We live in a massive, interconnected, globalized economy Walking into a room full of strangers, reading the room, and holding your own is a vital modern life skill.
Right.
Why is this such a massive shock to our biological system if we've successfully built a whole global society around interacting with new people?
This raises an important question. It does a vital modern skill, but we frequently confuse our ability to adapt with our ability to thrive.
Okay, adapt versus thrive.
Right. Evolutionary mismatch theory doesn't suggest humans are incapable of walking into a room of strangers. It points out the hidden biological tax we pay for doing so.
Ah, a
Yeah,
tax.
think about it like this. A human being can survive for years eating highly processed junk food, but their biology pays a heavy physiological tax for that mismatch. Similarly, the brain pays a cognitive tax for processing strangers.
So when you send a teenager into a classroom of 25 unknown peers,
Their brain involuntarily triggers that ancestral vigilance. They're running a continuous low-level threat assessment.
it's basically the biological equivalent of leaving a heavy background app running on your phone. You might be actively trying to use the calculator to do your math homework, but that background app is quietly, relentlessly draining your battery down to zero.
Yes. And by the end of the day, the phone is hot to the touch and completely dead. That cognitive drain leaves very little processing power for actual learning. The brain is just too busy mapping out new social hierarchies, assessing microexpressions, and navigating the unpredictable variables of unfamiliar people.
And this sets off a massive structural domino effect in how we design education.
Right.
Because we force kids into these artificial rooms full of strangers, adults then have to artificially control how those strangers interact.
Because you simply cannot put 25 highly vigilant, anxious teenagers in a room and let them run wild. Chaos would ensue.
Total chaos. So the system imposes strict, unnatural order, desks in rows, silence during lectures, raised hands to speak.
Right.
And by enforcing that rigid order to manage the strangers, the school system inadvertently destroys the primary way humans are biologically wired to learn, which is the second major mismatch, the death of free play.
Yeah, the contrast between how our biology expects us to learn and what we actually demand of students is jarring. The source highlights researcher Peter Gray, who studies how learning occurs in modern-day nomadic hunter-gatherer groups. These groups serve as a sort of mirror for our ancestral past.
Yeah.
In these societies, there are no desks, there are no lectures. Children acquire the vast majority of their cultural and practical knowledge through hours and hours of unstructured free play every single day.
And in our modern culture, we deeply misunderstand play. We treat it as a reward for finishing the real work, or just a way for kids to burn off physical energy so they'll sit still later.
Yeah, but evolutionary psychology tells us that play is the work. Catherine Gruskin, a researcher out of the new Paltz Evolutionary Psychology Lab, details the biological necessity of this mechanism.
What did she find?
Well, she emphasizes that play is not a break from cognitive development. It is the engine of it. During unstructured play, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, social regulation, and risk assessment, is actively wiring itself.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think of free play as a sophisticated flight simulator for adulthood.
I like that analogy.
Right. When kids are left alone to organize a game, negotiate rules, and inevitably argue over who was quote-unquote out, they are mapping the complex physics of human social interaction.
They are testing boundaries in a low-stakes environment where a crash doesn't mean actual death or exile from the tribe.
Exactly. And if you remove the flight simulator, you are sending a pilot into the sky who has only ever read a manual.
A manual dictated by an adult.
Yeah.
We have taken this critical evolutionary tool and basically eradicated it from the educational environment.
It's wild to think about.
It is.
Hmm.
In stark contrast to the hours of daily free play that shape the human brain, a modern public school might offer a meager 20 minutes of recess a day, heavily supervised, with strict rules about what games are even allowed.
So we are depriving the developing brain of the exact experiential environment it requires to mature naturally. We replace dynamic, interactive problem solving with passive, static listening.
Right, which forces us to look at the next domino in the sequence.
Okay, what's next?
Well, once you've removed the natural learning mechanism of play, how do you structure the remaining passive learning? You organize the students in a way that ignores the natural flow of human knowledge.
Let's dig into the third mismatch, which is the deeply unnatural assembly line of ages. Think back to your own middle school experience. If you remember feeling completely trapped in a bubble of identical immaturity, there is a biological reason for that.
Yeah, taking a step back and viewing the modern classroom objectively reveals a truly bizarre social structure.
It really does.
The system takes roughly 25 children who share the exact same birth year, isolates them in a single room, and places them under the direct, top-down instruction of a single adult stranger for 10 months.
It is the literal blueprint of an industrial manufacturing plant. We batch human beings by their manufacture date.
Exactly.
If you were manufactured between September 2010 and August 2011, you go into bin number 7. Then we move that bin down a conveyor belt, assuming everyone with the same timestamp needs the identical data downloaded into their brains simultaneously.
What's fascinating here is how radically this industrial age segregation limits the organic, cross-generational mentorship that defined human learning for millennia.
Because in the nomadic ecosystem, learning wasn't like that.
No, learning was never a centralized broadcast from one adult dictator to 25 identical subordinates. Knowledge flowed organically in a multi-age web. Children learned primarily from slightly older children.
And the mechanism there is incredibly efficient. Like a 5-year-old observing an 8-year-old is looking at an achievable goal. They mimic the older child's behavior.
Yes, and meanwhile, the 8-year-old is actively cementing their own grasp of the world by translating it for the 5-year-old. The act of teaching physically reinforces neural pathways.
And simultaneously, that 8-year-old is looking up to a 12-year-old to decode more complex social dynamics.
Right, it creates a built-in scaffolding of development, sometimes referred to in psychology as the zone of proximal development, but occurring naturally without adult intervention.
And we just eliminate that.
Entirely. When you isolate 25 8-year-olds together, you completely sever that biological safety net. They only have each other's highly limited, emotionally immature perspectives to draw from.
So the only anchor in the room is the single adult, creating a huge bottleneck for all knowledge and emotional regulation.
Exactly.
So let's look at the totality of what we have built. We take a biological organism that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to live in highly familiar, multi-generational clans. An organism designed to map the world through hours of self-directed, unstructured, free play.
Yeah.
We strip all of that away. We force that organism into a rigid indoor environment, surround them with hypervigilance-inducing strangers of the exact same age, restrict their physical movement, and demand their undivided attention.
It's a recipe for disaster.
When you subject any complex biological system to an environment that is radically mismatched to its design, the system doesn't just adapt peacefully, it breaks down.
It really does.
Which brings us to the most devastating consequence highlighted in the research, the immense mental health toll.
Yeah, when an organism is placed in an environment that severely contradicts the ancestral conditions that shaped its evolution, psychological and physiological distress is the inevitable result. It is a foundational rule of behavioral biology.
Wow.
The source material emphasizes that public schools, driven by these compounding mismatches, act as, quote-unquote, virtual breeding grounds for mental health crises, particularly social anxiety.
Virtual breeding grounds. That phrase shifts the entire burden of guilt. It tells us that the severe anxiety a student feels is not a personal glitch. It is a direct product being efficiently manufactured by the environment itself.
Because the human nervous system is behaving exactly as it should, given the stimuli.
Right.
Given the massive evolutionary mismatch, the chronic absence of play, the isolation from multi-age mentorship, and the daily immersion in a sea of strangers, it would actually defy biological logic if modern schools didn't cause high levels of social anxiety.
The brain is perceiving a constant, unresolvable threat.
Yeah. Exactly. Dr. Geher points to data in the article that grounds this theory in a chilling reality. The statistics regarding suicidal ideation in teens and young adults literally track the academic calendar.
That is so dark.
It's terrible. The rates of young people experiencing these profound mental health crises drop significantly during summer breaks, and then they reliably, tragically spike back up the moment school is in session.
And that correlation provides a stark illumination of the environment's role. During the summer, even if a teenager's life isn't perfect, the chronic daily cortisol drip of the evolutionary mismatch is temporarily paused.
Yes, the baseline vigilance required to navigate the institutional structure is finally lifted.
I want to challenge this narrative slightly just to make sure we are looking at all the variables.
Yeah, go ahead.
Are we entirely sure this mental health crisis is squarely the fault of the school's format? What about the overwhelming nature of the modern world itself?
Oh, the modern world is definitely a factor.
Right, because we have the constant dopamine manipulation of smartphones, the performative pressure of social media, the terrifying 24-hour news cycle, economic anxieties bleeding down from parents. Couldn't it simply be that being a human being in the 21st century is generally overwhelming, and the school is just where teenagers happen to spend their time while feeling that societal pressure?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your assessment of modern society as a pressure cooker is entirely accurate. The world outside the classroom is undeniably mismatched to our biology as well.
Okay.
However, the researchers argue that the school system operates as the prototype of evolutionary mismatch. Yes, society applies massive pressure, but the modern public school actively removes the biological safety valves required to release that pressure.
It traps developing brains in an environment that continuously triggers the stranger danger amygdala response, while simultaneously denying them the neuroregulation of free play and the emotional scaffolding of older peer mentors.
Exactly. The outside world brings the fire, but the school environment removes the exits, amplifying the psychological burn.
So, what does this all mean? If you are listening to this right now, maybe you're a student bracing yourself for another week of navigating the hallways, or perhaps you're a parent agonizing over why your incredibly bright child seems to shrink the moment they step into a classroom. Understanding this biological reality should offer a profound sense of relief.
It completely reframes the internal monologue. It stops the destructive cycle of asking, what is wrong with me? Or what is broken in my child? And redirects the scrutiny to the system. It asks, what is biologically misaligned in this environment?
If you or someone you care about struggles in a traditional educational setting, it is not a sign of personal deficiency. You are not uniquely flawed for finding the system exhausting.
No, not at all.
You are experiencing a highly logical, deeply biological reaction to a fundamentally unnatural environment. You are that brilliantly complex, finely tuned ancestral hardware being forced to process the clunky industrial-era software of modern education.
And recognizing the mismatch is the critical first step toward harm reduction. While we can't individually dismantle the global education system overnight, we can change how we operate within it.
Absolutely.
We can consciously seek out multi-age community groups outside of school hours. We can fiercely protect and prioritize whatever unstructured free playtime is available. And most importantly, we can stop pathologizing the exhaustion our brains feel when forced to perform in an environment they were never designed to inhabit.
Which leaves us with a final, slightly provocative thought for you to carry into the rest of your day.
Oh, here we go.
We've spent this entire deep dive focusing on the school system, analyzing how it impacts developing minds, but the brain doesn't suddenly rewrite its evolutionary code the day you graduate high school.
That is very true.
If the modern classroom is an evolutionary mismatch that breeds chronic anxiety, what does that say about the modern adult workplace? Think about the environments we accept as normal. Are our 9-to-5 fluorescent-lit cubicle farms, our heavily siloed corporate departments, and our endless Zoom meetings with people we barely know just the adult continuation of the third-grade classroom mismatch?
Wow. Yeah.
And if they are, how much incredible human potential, creativity, and simple daily joy are we bleeding out every single day to sustain an unnatural system? It's definitely something to consider the next time you find your battery draining while staring at a spreadsheet in a room full of strangers. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and remember to keep questioning the architecture of the systems around you.